why should we talk about the history of Switzerland and China? And why are we sitting here today? Why is it important for us to have this conversation?
Because if you want to understand the relations between Switzerland and China, the issues, the way Switzerland reacts to Chinese demands or to events in China, why Switzerland does not join the EU in sanctions, all those things, you have to understand the relations between Switzerland and China, because all those things go back decades. And if we understand the role that Switzerland played in the 19th century, how Switzerland and the People's Republic of China have figured out how to establish diplomatic relations, and how Switzerland figured as a hub, all these things, they do influence how Switzerland acts towards China today and how China acts towards Switzerland today. So history is very, very important, says the historian, but it's true.
So Switzerland was one of the first Western nations that recognized the People's Republic of China in the 1950s. Can you maybe tell some of the big events that happened since then that shaped the relationship between those two countries?
Yes. If you could, with the slides. Oh, clicker here. Okay, let me see. It works. So Switzerland recognized the People's Republic of China in January 1950. And the reason for this very early recognition, it wasn't the first in Europe, but the reason for that early recognition was that the Swiss felt that, they wanted to have good commercial relations with China. And one way of ensuring that Swiss companies would be able to continue to trade with China was to be liked by the Chinese communists, essentially. And so recognition was regarded as a way in that regard. Sorry. And the second reason was that, of course, the Chinese communists had shown that they were going to use force if necessary against citizens from enemy countries or countries that had offended China previously or were regarded as hostile towards the new China. And so if you wanted to make sure that Swiss citizens were safe in China, then having good diplomatic relations was, of course, a must. And the third reason was that Switzerland had some issues with neutrality during and after the Second World War, internationally speaking. And it wanted to establish itself as a neutral mediator in this Cold War that had just emerged. And in order to be a successful mediator, Switzerland had to have very good relations with nations from the Eastern Bloc and from the Western Bloc. And that meant that it had to have really diplomatic relations with communist China. Switzerland itself was anti-communist. The government, the Swiss officials, they were anti-communist. So it was a very rational, pragmatic solution. And what we're seeing here is very soon, because Switzerland was so quick to recognize China, and Switzerland did not have an imperial past in China that was based on colonies or spheres of interest. And I can go into that in more detail later on. But because of that, the Chinese were actually quite happy to establish diplomatic relations with Switzerland, which was done in September 1950. And right away, they start using Switzerland as a hub. We can see here, oh, could you go one back? I can't. Oh, there we go. You can see here, this is a list of all the things, all the aspects that were, that the Chinese used Switzerland for. Anything in Europe, those things, most of the relations, politics, business, spy networks, propaganda, communism, all these things, they were organized, orchestrated from Bern and later on from Geneva as well. And that's because Switzerland was located in such a great way. It was a neutral nation, meaning that you had loads of different diplomats from other countries in the country. And then it's also the headquarters of the UN. So absolutely excellent spot for China to set up all these networks. And if it it doesn't want to. If we go back to the phases, I'm really sorry, this doesn't really work well to me. No, other way.
No.
If we now see that in the late 1950s, early 1960s, China and the Soviet Union, there's tensions between the two countries. And by the 1960s, China wants to replace the Soviet Union as the leading communist power in the world. And this has a great effect on how China uses Switzerland as a hub, because now it's not just used as a European hub, now it's actually used to develop relations with African countries, with Latin American countries. We have a massive increase in travel from Latin America to Zurich, where people then travel to Bern, or from African countries, but also from China to Bern or Geneva, and then they travel on to Africa or to Latin America. So this hub function becomes global. And then once China and the United States improve relations, European nations, the ones that have not established relations, official diplomatic relations with China, they are now able to do so without fearing repercussions from the United States. And that's why this hub function disappears in the 1970s. So, and I think that gave Switzerland a lot of brownie points in terms of whenever there were bilateral tensions, China was very hesitant to threaten too extremely or to even sever relations, as it did with other nations, because it needed Switzerland more than Switzerland needed China by this point.
Thank you. There have been, after the lose of that hub function, a few, let's say, hiccups
Yes.
in the relationship between Switzerland and China. Can you give us a few examples and tell us a little bit on how those impacted the relationship?
Well, we do have some issues. Obviously, Taiwan has always been a massive problem. Had always been mentioned as an issue, but things really came to a head when there's usually several issues at the same time. For example, when the Tibetan refugees started arriving in Switzerland, and then there was a Tibetan monastery built. And then there was a time like the monastery opened, and then there were tiny Taiwanese delegations in Switzerland at the same time, and the Chinese just lost it. And this happened during the Cultural Revolution, when all the Chinese diplomats abroad were under extreme amount of pressure to act ideologically and really aggressively defend China's positions. And that's when we had, in 1967, things came to a breaking point. But China at that point severed relations with numerous countries, and it did not come to that point with Switzerland, because the Swiss eventually in Bern realized that a lot of this posturing that happened from Beijing was a necessity because of the climate of the Cultural Revolution. And a Swiss diplomat then sent a telegram to Bern saying, if you don't stop reacting emotionally to these threats, they're gonna destroy our embassy. And so from that moment on, Bern slowly stopped reacting extremely. They let the Chinese say their thing, said their own thing, and then that was okay. And so that kind of went back from there. And then obviously the second massive issue that happened was in 1999. This was way after the hub function, also involving Tibet. The Tibetan protesters with Tiang and Bern. That was...
As you've already mentioned them, I'm not sure who read it in the news, but the Swiss Federal Council released a report just last week, 2 weeks ago, stating that the Tibetans and Uyghurs in Switzerland have been systematically monitored, threatened, and by the Chinese state actors here in Switzerland. The report was co-authored by Ralph Weber, who also co-authored this book here. Is this a new development, or why is the report coming out now?
No, it's not a new development. And the report is coming out now because China has amped up its measures to silence dissidents massively in the last few years. But this has always been going on. If you could go on to the Tibetan slide. There we go. So after the massive uprising in Tibet in 1959, tens of thousands of Tibetans fled. And and they went mostly to Nepal and India. And Swiss foundations tried to support these refugees from the very beginning. We have an outpouring of sympathy for these Tibetan refugees, and some organizations in Switzerland then tried to make it possible for Tibetan refugees to come to Switzerland. And we have the Aktion Eschlimann, which dealt with Tibetan orphans, which turned out not to be orphans, most of them eventually. But the federal government, the federal council decided to allow up to 1,000 Tibetans. And the focus was on families, which is very interesting. So they specifically said Tibetan families should be settled in Switzerland. And they tried to figure out what to do with the Tibetans. So it was like, oh, they could work in, mountainside or do farm. And eventually Kuhn Rikon decided to take them in. We know them, the pressure cookers. I don't know, I grew up with a pressure cooker. Okay. And so a lot of the Tibetans settled down in this area. That's also where the monastery, Tibetan Institute, was built later on. And from the moment that we have these Tibetans in Switzerland, there's this outpouring of sympathy for these Tibetans. Swiss society has, until today, I think, is very pro-Tibetan. And there's loads of campaigns where the Swiss are asked to give money, and the pictures I included here, they're kind of, you can see how well this was done. The media campaign accompanying these efforts is amazing. You have these beautiful Tibetans, wonderfully, always smiling. The Swiss are super smiling. I mean, they're going to the Rütli, they're wearing Appenzell, it's unreal. Then there's the super Swiss flag. I mean, it could not be more, as in, look at these wonderful Tibetans. They're just like us, mountain people. They love their freedom. And there's the big bad communist power. And we should also understand that a few years prior, 1956, there was the Hungarian uprising, and you have a democratic uprising that's crushed by a communist power. And again, for the Swiss, they're outpouring of sympathy. So the Tibetans, the Swiss have always had a weak spot for Tibetans. And to come back to your question, what we see, and this is not, I have not found systematic evidence, but I've looked at a lot of archival records. And what we're seeing in the archival records is that the Chinese diplomats in Switzerland have always tried to silence Tibetans in Switzerland. They have intervened with Bern to silence Tibetan refugees and Tibetans. And they have also tried to silence Tibetans by making them afraid. So we have cases where the Tibetan Institute calls up Bern and says, the Chinese have been here again with a car. And they've just had their car park in front of the Tibetan Institute, but the people are scared. This is in the 60s. We have reports where fellow Chinese civilians, this is also what we have today, the use of civilians, fellow Chinese are used to travel close to Rikon, near Rikon. And again, just the fact that people in and around Rikon saw this person made them afraid. And you have these reports. And that to me shows, okay, this is a longer thing that's been happening. And the Swiss government reacted in as much as that it said the Tibetan refugees were not allowed to be politically active whatsoever. And this was a way to placate China. And they said to China, look, this is part of the Swiss humanitarian tradition. We've always done it. Lenin was allowed to come to Switzerland too, they always said. And so there was kind of eventually the Chinese said, okay, as long as they're not allowed to say anything, but it's obviously, and what we're seeing now is that in the last few years, the Chinese government has massively increased its efforts to silence any dissident, any activist, and all over the world. And so it makes sense that has become a lot more systematic as well.
From a historic perspective, do you think the report will change anything, or will it change the relationship between Switzerland and China?
I don't think so. Because when you look at how the report itself, the report that Ralph Weber and the fellow researchers wrote, is quite detailed. But very typically for Chinese United Front work, it's kind of in this shady area. It's not outright criminal, or not, a lot of it isn't. They're not official criminal offenses. So that makes it a bit difficult. And the other thing is that China has never had to fear sanctions from Switzerland. When we've had the Tiananmen massacre, European countries issued sanctions. Switzerland didn't. They said, we're appalled and we're shocked, but there were no sanctions. The treatment of the Uyghurs, the EU issued sanctions. Switzerland hasn't. I mean, for China, Switzerland is quite a reliable partner. Historically speaking, this has never been an issue. So yes, the government is going to say, like, based on historical, the way things have been in the past, the government is going to say, as it has in the report, it's unacceptable, and if diplomats act out of line, they'll be expelled, but no sanctions.
There's so much I could ask, but you've just said, like, there has always been a bit of a sweet spot for Tibetans here in Switzerland. The picture of China, on the other hand, bit of a other thing. Stereotypes and the public image haven't been always too good. You've also extensively written on that topic. Could you share a little bit, like, what those stereotypes are and how they also evolved over time?
Okay. Yes. So I wrote a book on this. That's why I'm kind of overwhelmed a little bit. But yes, I think there's different stereotypes, of course. If you want to go to the dragon real quick. This one? Further back and further back. One more. Okay. So I think one of the things that we're seeing a lot in the media is the portrayal of China as a dragon, as this aggressive, threatening, mythical beast. And I would argue that it goes back to the Qing dynasty, because during that time in the 19th century, the Western powers had to legitimize the colonial wars that they were fighting in China. So you have the Opium Wars, and then you have numerous wars that are fought about spheres of interest or colonies as such. And what we're seeing, or what I found, is that cartoons with a Chinese dragon that threatens Western civilization, they make their first appearance in European media in the late 19th century. They coincide with this area. And the Qing, of course, had used long, what we translate as dragon, as a symbol for imperial power. And in China, this is a very positive, it's a mythical creature, but it's an imperial symbol. And in the West, if you could go to the next slide, the dragon is the thing you have to kill. The hero is the person that kills the dragon. The dragon slayer is the hero, not the dragon. So for cartoonists that are seeing these Chinese dragons everywhere, because everybody that has a little bit of money buys something pseudo-Chinese at that point, like a little China set or whatever. So you have these dragons everywhere, and they realize that we can just use that dragon as an image for China, and every reader of a newspaper is automatically going to know that's the bad thing that has to be killed. Automatic justification of the use of force. And from that moment on, we have kind of this image of this threat of China, and it's a threat to the West. We're all threatened by it. This idea of the yellow peril, this super racist image, again, is sometimes also including Japan, sometimes it's only Japan, but it also focuses on this number of often dehumanized Chinese or Asians that are threatening the West. And this is actually I've used this on the cover of my book, Framing China. The picture on the right, it's a Swiss cartoon. And it makes fun of the fact that Chinese nationalism causes rebellions or Chinese measures against Western capitalists in China. And it's interesting that Switzerland isn't part of it. It's actually quite gleeful cartoon, but you can see this dangerous dragon. It's yellow as well. So again, we have that racism in there. And once China becomes communist, the focus on the mass of the Chinese as a threat to the West remains. Now it's also, a lot of it is red, but the dragon has remained. So this this threat as well. And I think it's important because it's such an effective metaphor that everybody uses almost constantly. And it's, I mean, it's, for me, very fascinating.
We have a bit of a running gag in the team that whenever a publication comes out about China with a dragon on it, that post the picture in the chat. And because it's still, until today, so many books, yes, articles, they have that image. What would you recommend? How can we maybe foster a bit more nuanced and realistic understanding and image of China through those imageries? What's your recommendation?
Well, for me, all these kind of national or these transnational images of China, they're kind of based on this us versus China, this kind of the West as such. But when you're actually looking at the bilateral history, the bilateral relations of the different countries, they had very different relations, and it's an easy way out. It's very easy to say China threatens the West, but when in fact each country has acted towards China in a different way. And just look at today, Switzerland has a very different relation with China than, for example, the EU. Very, very different. So it makes no sense to use these kind of blanket stereotypes that are also, again, extremely racist, and particularly nowadays. I am worried about these stereotypical images when we're talking about how every Chinese student is a spy and all these things. That fills me with dread. Like, that's really, we have to be careful here. So it's not helpful.
Bringing it up, you always bring up new topics that I want to talk about. You just brought up the Chinese student being a spy stereotype. It's a fact, though, that there is espionage in Switzerland to China. Is one of the famous recent incidents, the one in Meiringen, where a Chinese family with a restaurant near the military airport was accused of espionage. Can you talk about that case, but also like about a little bit about the history of Chinese espionage in Switzerland?
There's a slide on that.
Yeah.
Do you know with Mao, with the Mao leaning against a bomb. Yes, this one. I wrote a slide because it's a bit confusing for some people. So what I'm trying to show on this slide is that the different types of espionage that we're seeing that China has been engaging in, I mean, human intelligence, not the other ones, but the use of spies has been there since the very beginning. In fact, the very first ambassador, Chinese ambassador in Switzerland, was a high-ranking intelligence official. And we have numerous consuls until today that are intelligence officials. So they come with an intelligence background. And what China does, and I think what makes it a little bit different from the CIA and Western intelligence agencies, is that it relies heavily on civilians. And what I try to list there is actually the use of civilians. So they're agents or informants. They're not intelligence officials. I think that's very, very important. They're not intelligence officers like the professionally trained ones. These are people that were recruited. And what we're seeing is that almost everything we're seeing today, any kind of these forms of espionage, they go back all the way to 1950. We see these efforts from the arrival of the very first Chinese diplomats. We see how this has developed from there. In January 1950, there's a meeting where all the Chinese in Switzerland are invited. And one of the questions that they're asked is, does anybody study nuclear physics? And then they systematically contact ethnic Chinese, because for the Chinese, it doesn't matter what citizenship you have. If you have an ethnic background, if your ancestors were at some point Chinese, your loyalty is to the Chinese. Like, your loyalty is to the People's Republic of China. It doesn't matter if you're Vietnamese or Taiwanese or whatever. No, ethnicity is everything. So they're contacting systematically scientists all over Europe, all the way to the United States, and they bribe them, they threaten them with their family to make them collaborate. This is what we're seeing today. And this goes back all the way to them. We have students here that are forced, if they don't collaborate, their parents suffer. If they do collaborate, their parents get preferential treatment. Their parents might be able to go back home to mainland China, and so it continues. And it's systematic. So I think it's fascinating that this is not something that's just happening now. It's always happened.
I could go on forever with questions from myself, but I do want to open it up for questions from the room.